that I've ever seen that suggested that he did anything other than put up a green light. Branch Rickey actually came to Versailles and discussed this situation with my grandfather. And they came out and sat in the cabin behind my grandfather's house behind a desk. They were on either side of a desk that I now have in my living room. And they discussed whether or not to bring Robinson in. Now this is according to my grandfather. And my grandfather said that he told Rickey that you go ahead and bring him in and I'll support you. And Rickey, of course, came and went ahead and brought him in. And after he brought him in, he did support him in a lot of different ways. There was a story, there was a manager in Philadelphia. I believe he was from Alabama, named Ben Chapman. Is that right, Bill?
Correct.
And Ben Chapman was pretty vocal in his determination to cause trouble for Robinson when he came to Philadelphia. And I think he said something to the effect that when Robinson comes to Philadelphia, I'm going to make trouble for him. And my grandfather wired him and said, you make trouble for Robinson and I'm going to make trouble for you. And I believe he had an assistant at the time that he brought into the commissioner's office that he sent around to many of the major league cities to try to smooth over some of the potential problems that might occur. He was another Kentuckian from the northern part of our state named Frenchy DeMoisy. And Frenchy DeMoisy was a All-American at the University of Kentucky under Adolph Rupp, one of his very first All-Americans, and he was 6'7" and weighed about 350 pounds. One of the other things that he happened to do for my grandfather, when my grandfather was involved in political campaigns, he would speak in the courthouse yard. And Frenchy was his driver and his companion and assistant. And the courthouse yards would be filled up with people, and every now and then, there'd be a heckler or two. Well, Frenchy's job was to circulate through the crowd. And if anybody started heckling, they'd have a little visit with Frenchy. And you can imagine who got the best of that. But Frenchy provided the same role to him as commissioner. And that's one of the, I think, little told stories was Frenchy behind the scenes going around to all of these different major league cities and just in his own illimitable way, pouring some oil on troubled waters. My grandfather was always very proud of his role in this, and he always felt like he didn't get the credit that he should have gotten for it. And he really tried later in life to get credit for it. Now, I've always had my own personal theory about this. He was a pretty decent politician in his day, and I'm of the opinion that he was pretty certain that what he was doing was not overly popular. By letting Robinson in at the time, it was not a popular thing to do. And it certainly wasn't popular back with his home folks. So when it was going on, during the heat of it all, I think he tried to keep something of a low profile, as low as he could keep at the time, and probably did not go out of his way to take credit for it at the time. He was determined to do it and to make the right decision, but he felt like it's probably better for him politically if he didn't take a whole lot of credit for it. Well, later on, he decided he wanted the credit, and by that time it was too late. That's my own personal theory anyway, and by that time the horse was out of the barn. But it was always something that he was very proud of. And at the end of the day, again, of all of the things that you can say or not say about it, he put up a green light, and Landis had put up a red light. And that was extremely important. He was always convinced that had he taken the other position, he could have put it off. He could have put it off. He could have stopped it for a while. Of course, events like these are inevitable. This was a much larger movement, as Chris said, than any individual people. It was a societal thing. But I do think that it was hastened as a result of him being the baseball commissioner. And the other thing you've got to remember in terms of the significance of it, baseball was the most popular public institution in the country at the time. It was the national pastime. Baseball players were national heroes. It was an important societal issue. The integration of baseball, and from a time perspective, it took place 7 years before Brown versus Board of Education, 7 years before the schools were desegregated in this country. And I think that certainly shows, the timing of it shows just how significant and crucial an event it was in civil rights history in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, especially for putting perspective on all that, on the aftermath as well of Jackie Robinson. Now we have Bill Marshall, and he's going to be batting cleanup for us, and he's going to take us through the end of the era.
Thanks, Mike. I don't know how many of you saw the World Series, and since you're here, I assume that most of you are baseball fans. And how difficult it was as far as hitting was concerned in the World Series, and how pitching dominated, and how the cleanup hitters fared so poorly on both teams. Boston's cleanup hitter did a little bit better. But I hope that as the cleanup hitter here, that I can bring some of the runs home that I see out there on base. I really didn't know exactly what I was going to say, because I have a lot of different things I could say. I could keep you here ad nauseum, and I'm not going to do that. But I thought I would try to respond in a way to each of the other participants, and maybe get you to think not only along the lines that they presented, but also maybe think about some other things. First, we'll tackle Pee Wee Reese. I loved Dick's presentation. And in fact, I think we ought to give him another hand. So, and you know, as someone who probably could pick the movie 42 apart, which I won't do for you, because I hate people that do that, but I will later on if you want. I won't pick apart what you did, because I actually can't. But one of the things I want you to think about, was it really an easy decision for Pee Wee Reese when he joins the Dodgers at the beginning of the 1946 season, after he's been on that ship in the Navy? Was it all that easy for him to make that decision that he was going to support Jackie Robinson? Had he really made up his mind to support Jackie Robinson? I mean, folks, where is he from? And well, let me read this to you. This is a quotation from Jules Tygel's book, Baseball's Great Experiment, which I think is one of the best sports books ever, let alone baseball book. And this is an interview that he did with Pee Wee Reese. And Reese says, "In the park that I grew up in, there were no blacks allowed. Blacks got in the back of the buses. They had a special fountain to drink from. I don't guess that I ever shook the hand of a black person." Reese doubted that Robinson would succeed because, as all white Southerners knew, blacks didn't know how to handle pressure situations. Pee Wee says, "You hear this all your life, you believe it." Did he really have an easy time? If you transpose this and think about all the other ball players, and where are are a preponderance of white baseball players at this point in time going to come from? Where do they come from today? North of the Mason-Dixon line, I'm sorry, but we have, Kentucky's cold enough, isn't it? I grew up in northeastern Ohio, and maybe a third of our games were rained out, snowed out. We couldn't clear the fields. It's awful growing up in the north and wanting to play baseball. Come on. All right, Kentucky's bad enough. Most of them are from the south. Think about people who 42 made into villains. People like Dixie Walker. And I can talk about him later. So, again, Pee Wee Reese didn't sign the petition. He refused the petition, but it wasn't as an easy decision as we make it out to be. His roommate was one Kirby Higbee, who was one of the conspirators. You didn't mention Kirby, I don't think, today, but I think you've probably mentioned him in the past. He wrote a book called The High Hard One, which is really not a bad book considering that he was the author. He was a guy that's was kind of a train wreck during his life, actually. But he says that he roomed with Reese and claims further that he and Reese had several discussions with Lorraine Day, who was Leo DeRocher's live-in partner, and Leo DeRocher. This is for a couple of weeks before the petition. I mean, this thing was being discussed by the players. It just didn't come about. It just didn't happen. Pee Wee did a lot of really neat things thereafter. I mean, once he crossed the line, he didn't sign the petition, but once he crossed the line and decided that he was going to support Jackie Robinson, he did. And there are many different instances, and Dick mentioned a couple of them, where he actually made a public showing of support of Jackie Robinson. And eventually, Jackie identified Pee Wee as probably the most important friend that he had on the Brooklyn Dodgers. So think about that for a while, and think about, you had other white players who, and Dick mentioned this, received hate mail, and lots of it, from people that they knew in their own hometowns and from other places. If you're from Alabama or Mississippi, forget it. Georgia, you're going to get this hate mail, and they did. Dixie Walker had a sporting goods shop, and he was honestly afraid that he was going to lose his business because people would not frequent the business. Ball players, except for a very few, had jobs all year round, not just playing baseball, but they had other jobs. They had, if they were smart, unlike people like Mickey Mantle, whose bowling alley went under, you had businesses that you invested in. There was no, until 1946, there were no pensions. You had to live on your own wits, and we held them up on pedestals, but they were human beings just like the rest of us. Not like today, where you have trouble getting a hold of them. They were simply human beings with the same kinds of problems that we had back in those days. They might have made a little bit more money than some of us did, but not a whole lot. Coming to Chris, I can't disagree with much he said either. In fact, I can't disagree with anything. He said it was a Branch Rickey narration, and that is the narration that's been basically passed on. It's the narration that is honest, it's on our backs as we go through all this, and it was one that was actually, Branch Rickey, Bill Veg would hate this, but Branch Rickey was probably the smartest baseball guy in the 20th century, at least one of them. But he was very imperfect in many different ways. And if he basically organized all this, orchestrated is the word I was searching for, this whole situation. Although he, as Chris also said, Jackie Robinson was not supposed to be the only player. He had several in mind, and he did bring up some other players, like Dan Bankhead, for instance. But he had Don Newcomb and Roy Campanella waiting in the wings, who he actually signed the following year in 1947 and sent them to the low minors in places where they shouldn't have been. They should have been in higher classification. It was a much larger thing. But even so, and Ben alludes to this also, This is part of the entire civil rights movement. It is, and this has been going on basically we didn't go this far, but certainly not in baseball, but into the 19th century. And it goes on, and baseball gets involved with it as you get into the Negro Leagues and as you get sports writers following these games and becoming part of this. It's a movement that goes on, and there are many, many unsung heroes or heroines involved with this. And many of them indeed are the sports writers who are part and parcel of this. And I think Chris's book is filling a tremendous void in this. And when Ben talks about this as being 7 years ahead of Brown versus Board of Education, I would suggest to you that Jackie Robinson's entrance into baseball was the most important single event after World War II, between World War II and Brown versus Board of Education, that happened, that led to this particular decision, that led to the atmosphere that allowed white Americans to accept integration, to begin to accept integration. And as much as we can malign Happy Chandler for some of the things he might have said when he said them, because he would say whatever came to his mind, and a lot of it was scripted, so he knew he was going to say ahead of time. Invariably, he almost always did the right thing. Sometimes I couldn't explain that, but he did. And, the Sturgis thing, he never gets credit for. And that's probably one of the most important things that he did in terms of race relations in the state. Kentucky is such a paradox. Happy Chandler is one of the biggest paradoxes ever. If you want to look at him, study him, he is probably one of the most fascinating politicians to ever grace the governorship or the senatorial chair in the state. So anyway, I would agree with both of you. And this is also, when you look at baseball, this is the only time that baseball was in the vanguard of American social history. Baseball's always behind everything else. I mean, instant replay, way behind. Anyway, all right. I would like to say a couple things. Ben won't be totally happy with me on this one. But I'm not sure Ben's ever always totally happy with me, so it's probably just as well. Sort of like being married, right? Anyway, I'm sorry, I shouldn't make a sexist statement like that, but when we talk in terms of Branch Rickey coming for sales to talk to Happy Chandler, and Happy, I interviewed Happy 8 times over a 3-year period. I got the same stories that Ben got. I'm sure they were the same, because by the time I was there, he had those stories down pat. And I'll wager, Ben and I haven't talked about this, but I'll wager that Happy would tell him some of the same stories again and again, and they were almost verbatim.
Sure.
Yeah.
Guarantee it.
Yeah, guarantee it, see. Every time I went to interview Happy, and as I said 7 or 8 times, he wanted to talk about Jackie Robinson. When I went to interview him 8 times, only once did I want to talk to him about Jackie Robinson. It was on his mind. And when I was interviewing him, it was before he was put in the Hall of Fame, and this is the one thing, the last thing of his rich career that he wanted to fulfill. He wanted to be in the Hall, and he knew, people would laugh at Happy, in terms of, his vernacular, in terms he could sing. Yeah, he had a beautiful voice. He could sing at the drop of a hat, and would at the drop of a hat. And Mama would sing with him too, while she said had a beautiful voice.
By the way, Bill, she said he had a lousy voice. That was her view.
I heard him sing, and
she said he just yelled. He was just too loud.
I heard him sing, and I think I'd probably tell Mama that she's wrong, and then I'd run. Mama was something else too. When we look at Happy, he always had this one story, and he knew that if he could get enough sports writers to buy into this particular story and his details, that as he told it, it would be his ticket to the Hall of Fame. And it worked. Consummate politician, it worked. However, do I have some doubts about Branch Rickey coming to Versailles to visit Happy Chandler in 1947? No. He did come in 1947, but did he come in January, as Happy said? I don't think so. I can't prove for a fact that he didn't come in January. I can prove, however, he came in June, when Jackie Robinson's already playing half a season. And why did he come in June? He came in June to get Leo DeRocher reinstated. And so, now, is the gist of this story correct? Ben's green light, you better believe it. I'll read you a couple of quotations in a minute. That's absolutely true. I mean, Happy is responsible for that. He is the person who actually created an atmosphere that allowed Branch Rickey to do what he did. And in fact, let me read you this quotation. In 1943, when Judge Landis was commissioner still, Paul Robeson, the great opera singer, the African-American opera singer, and fabulous athlete, came to an owners' meeting, and before he walked in, and I interviewed William O. DeWitt, who was one of Branch Rickey's right-hand men when he was at St. Louis, but that later became the owner of the St. Louis Browns and was involved with the Cincinnati Reds, etc. And of course, he's got other DeWitts who are still involved with baseball. I interviewed him a couple of times in Cincinnati, and he said that Landis told them, all the owners, just to hear him out. Hear Robeson out, don't say anything to him. So this is what DeWitt said. Robeson made a great presentation. No one asked him any questions, and after he left, there wasn't a single word about what he had said. It wasn't even discussed in positive or negative terms. That is the red light, folks. That is Judge Landis. Happy Chandler changed that atmosphere. So going back to 1947 in January, well, let me take you to June. In Branch Rickey's papers, and by the way, I was the person that processed Happy Chandler's baseball papers at University of Kentucky, so I knew them pretty well. And I went through Branch Rickey's papers at the Library of Congress. I couldn't find anything about a January meeting, but in Branch Rickey's papers, I found this about the June meeting. After going over all the details of the meeting, Rickey says, the commissioner was a very royal entertainer and has a very beautiful residence. In fact, it's a showplace with gardens, trees, cabin, swimming pool, etc. It's quite pleasing and elaborate. He gave me a Kentucky smoked ham and drove me to the airport at Lexington and waved to me continuously while I was in sight. I can see Happy doing that. I have Sikim. I think that many of you will agree with me that that has a first-time visit kind of thing. Now, it's not unimpeachable. I will grant you that. But the owners, including Branch Rickey, met, and along with Happy Chandler and the two presidents of one of the National, one of the American League, met in Los Angeles at the Major League meetings in December of 1946. Would Branch Rickey come and visit Happy Chandler in January of 1947, 3 weeks later, to talk about this, when they could have very easily talked about this in private in Los Angeles? And I think that's probably what happened. Now, let me read you two more quotations and I'll quit. Ben Chandler mentioned that, one quotation, I believe it was Ben, about Happy's support of African Americans in baseball. And this is what Happy said at this meeting in December of 1946 in Los Angeles. And he told this to a writer, I think it was Rick Roberts from the Pittsburgh Courier. From what I have heard since I've been here, Robinson is perhaps the best all-around athlete this country has produced. My goodness, what more can you say about Jackie Robinson than that? Also, earlier in the year, he said this to Wendell Smith: I think every boy in America who wants to play professional baseball should have the chance, regardless of race, creed, or color. I've always said, and I repeat now, that Negro players are welcome in baseball. I think the gist of Happy Chandler's story is absolutely correct. I just think that the details will probably change a little bit to serve certain purposes. And because Happy, like many of the people that Chris are talking about, we're talking about writers, we're talking about people in the Communist Party, people who are looking to create an equal America, saw baseball as a way and a means of doing this, and it really worked. And all those people, and Pee Wee Reese too, made great contributions to that cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Drove in some runs there. Thank you. Okay, we have about 15 minutes here. We're open for questions. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question of Bill, if I could. I read your book many years ago. Most of it. One thing that didn't come up with your all's conversations is something I found fascinating. I actually used to work in that building, the Crew Tower in Cincinnati, and Governor Chandler moved the commissioner's office from New York, which was the seat of press, Cincinnati. And I was curious, from your all's perspective, how that played into ultimately his demise as a commissioner.
If you read Red Barber's book on 1947, he's very critical of Happy Chandler for moving the office because it took him away from the East, it took him away from the heart of you have 3 teams in New York, in the New York area, and you have a ton of sports writers. It took him away from Boston, it took him away from Philadelphia. Each city has 2 teams. And he said, here was an opportunity to move it from Chicago, where there were 2 teams, to the East. And you can, let your story play literally with all these sports writers. I don't think Happy wanted any part of these sports writers because I think what he really wanted to do was, the reason he put it in Cincinnati is because it was only 90 miles away from home. And his office looked over the Ohio River to Kentucky, and he said, from there I can see the promised land.
Well, I can tell you that's exactly it. He just wanted to be close to home, and he thought he could get away with it. And I think it probably did cost him.
Yes, sir.
Bill and Ben, if you bring one other person into